The Stork Club, Manhattan, February 1946. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling like ghosts that refused to leave. Out in the main room, New York's most powerful and privileged people laughed too loud and drank too much, trying to forget a war that had only just ended. But in the back, behind a heavy door and a curtain, only a handful of men were allowed to pass. Another kind of war was waiting to start. When Lucky Luciano walked into the VIP room, every mobster at the table stood up except one. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was at the head of the long oak table, cigar burning between his fingers, eyes locked on the man who had unified the Italian Mafia and reshaped American organized crime. Luciano's bodyguards stiffened instantly. Hands drifted toward jackets. One of them half raised a coat flap, just enough to show the dark outline of a pistol. Bumpy didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the movement. His right hand rested lightly on a leather briefcase sitting on the table in front of him, as if he had all the time in the world. Luciano lifted one hand without looking back. The bodyguards froze. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost casual. Let him sit. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The man who had survived assassination attempts, prison, and the Castle-Amherst War now found himself looking at someone who simply refused to stand up. On paper, it was disrespect. In reality, it was something else. The black man at the head of the table controlled something Luciano needed more than soldiers, more than muscle, more than fear. Harlem's numbers racket. And what Bumpy Johnson said in the next 60 seconds would either forge an alliance that changed organized crime for a generation, or start a war that would paint New York's streets red. He took a slow drag on his cigar, let the smoke roll out between his teeth, and waited. But to understand why a single man could sit down when the mob stood up, you have to go back. Not to Manhattan, to the red dirt roads of the American South. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. The world he opened his eyes to was a world that had already decided who he was supposed to be. Sharecropper, laborer, disposable. His parents worked too hard for too little. The rules were simple: keep your head down, say, "Yes, sir," survive. Except Bumpy's head didn't look like everyone else's. He had a small swelling on the back of his skull. A little bump that earned him a nickname before he could spell his own name. Bumpy, kids can be cruel, but sometimes a nickname sticks and turns into armor. By the time he was a teenager, nobody in his neighborhood said Ellsworth. It was Bumpy, always Bumpy. He didn't fall in love with school. He fell in love with words, with books. He'd stand outside the library, barred from entry, waiting for someone kind enough to bring him something to read. Chess books, novels, anything with strategy, with people playing long games in a world that kept trying to push them off the board. When his family moved north to Harlem during the Great Migration, he stepped into a different battle. Harlem in the 1920s was alive in a way the South never could be. Jazz spilling out of basement clubs, poets and painters, nightlife and danger. Black doctors, lawyers, hustlers, maids, musicians, all crowded onto the same streets. It was beautiful, it was broke. And it was full of people who understood that survival and dignity didn't always come from a paycheck. That's where Bumpy found Madame Stephanie St. Clair. French accent, sharp suits, sharper eyes. They called her the Queen of Harlem. She didn't ask the banks for permission to move money. She created her own. The numbers racket, pennies and nickels, dimes and quarters. People would dream about a better life at night, and write those dreams down as numbers in the morning. They'd hand coins to runners on the street and wait. If the numbers hit, maybe you could pay your rent. Maybe you could send your kid to school for one more year. Maybe you could hold your head a little higher on Sunday. To outsiders, it was a cheap lottery. To Harlem, it was the unofficial bank, the poor man's Wall Street, the only institution that sometimes paid back. Madame ran it with iron discipline. When one of her men tried to cheat, she made sure the entire neighborhood knew what happened to him. But when someone hit a big number, she paid, even if it hurt. Trust was the product she sold. She needed someone to protect that trust. Not just with fists, with brains. She found him in a quiet, well-dressed young man who played chess in the park and read Shakespeare on 135th Street. A kid who was just as comfortable at a kitchen table with a grandmother telling stories as he was in the back of a smoky bar. Bumpy. At first, he was an enforcer. Collect the money. Make sure the runners stayed honest. Keep an eye on the cops who were always 2 paydays away from switching sides. But it didn't take long for Madame to realize he was more than muscle. He was strategy. He knew which corners made the most money. which runners had family problems and might be tempted to skim, which policemen could be bought cheaply and which ones needed something more personal. Harlem started to whisper his name, not just because of what he did, but what he didn't do. He didn't bully for fun. He didn't hit people just to make a point. He listened. Then he acted. He knew something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. In a neighborhood where almost everyone is poor, the one thing that still has value is respect. He earned it quietly, consistently. That was the world he protected when Dutch Schultz came to town. Schultz wasn't from Harlem. He didn't care about Harlem. He cared about the money flowing through its streets. He was brutal and openly racist. To him, the numbers business was just another racket. These were stupid people handing over cash. Why shouldn't he be the one to take it? He brought muscle, guns, cops in his pocket. He thought that if you shot enough people, eventually you owned everything they'd ever touched. But Harlem didn't bow. Madame sent. Claire didn't fold. And Bumpy didn't let Schultz's men breathe without permission. Runners loyal to Madame disappeared from Schultz's reach. Stores that used to pay him quietly stopped. Every time he tried to tighten his grip, something slipped away. At the same time, another man in New York was playing a very different kind of game. Charles "Lucky" Luciano. He came from the other side of the city and the other side of the ocean. Born in Sicily, raised in the tenements of the Lower East Side, he cut his teeth running with gangs long before he could grow a mustache. He learned English in the streets, business in the back rooms, and violence in the alleys. But like Bumpy, he didn't just like fighting, he liked winning. Where old-world bosses saw honor and revenge, Lucky saw inefficiency. The Italian Mafia was tearing itself apart in the Castellammer's War. Two factions killing each other over traditions, pride, and grudges that outsiders couldn't even pronounce. Luciano decided that was bad for business. Quietly, he built alliances with Mayor Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and other young, ambitious men who didn't care which village your grandfather came from. They cared how much money you could make. He played both sides of the war until he didn't need either. In 1931, he helped orchestrate the assassination of Salvatore Maranzano, the boss of bosses, and ended the old system with one brutal move. Then he built something new. No more single man at the top pretending to be a king. Instead, he created the Commission, a board of directors for crime. Representatives from the major families would meet, settle disputes, divide territories, and most importantly, agree on this. No more unnecessary wars. They were bad for profit. Lucky transformed the Mafia from a collection of feuding clans into a nationwide corporation of crime. Gambling, drugs, unions, docks, everything ran smoother under his rules. For a while. But success draws attention. And attention brings prosecutors. In 1936, Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey decided Lucky Luciano was going to be his ladder to the governor's mansion. He attacked Lucky where he thought he was weakest: vice, prostitution. Lucky was arrested, charged, and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. They shipped him upstate to Dannemora, the Siberia of America, a concrete tomb near the Canadian border. Nobody thought he'd run the streets again. Not in person, but war has a way of changing plans. By 1942, World War II was in full swing, and American ships were mysteriously catching fire or going missing near New York's docks. Sabotage was whispered. The government needed help in a world it did not understand. The docks had always been mob territory. Italian workers, Italian foremen, Italian bosses. Somebody in the Office of Naval Intelligence had a thought that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. What if we ask Lucky Luciano to help? From his cell, Lucky negotiated a deal. If he used his influence to keep the docks quiet and provided intelligence on Sicily to smooth the Allied invasion, the government would consider commuting his sentence. He agreed. He made phone calls, sent messages. The fires stopped. The docks calmed. When the Allies landed in Sicily, they found locals who suddenly seemed very cooperative. In 1946, true to their word, mostly, the state of New York commuted Lucky's sentence. They opened his cell, gave him a suit, let him walk out the gate. But there was a catch: deportation. He could walk out of prison, but not into his old life. The United States government had decided that Charles "Lucky" Luciano was too dangerous to keep. They would send him back to Italy. Permanently, he had 3 weeks before they put him on a boat. 3 weeks to make sure that the empire he'd bled for didn't collapse the moment he stepped off American soil. The 5 families were, on paper, in order. Frank Costello handled day-to-day operations for the Luciano family. Vito Genovese schemed from the shadows. Albert Anastasia kept a murderous grip on the docks. Mayor Lansky grew money out of numbers on ledgers. But one part of the machine wasn't under their thumb: Harlem. The numbers racket there was making millions every week, and it wasn't Italian. It was black. It was community-based. It ran on trust the way their operations ran on fear. They had tried to move in once through Dutch Schultz. He ended up face down in a New Jersey tavern, full of bullets, mumbling nonsense on his deathbed while the commission quietly divided up his assets. Luciano looked at Harlem and saw an opportunity. He also saw a warning. But he was smarter than Schultz. "You don't rule people you don't understand," he told his men. "Not if you want to keep them paying." Around a polished table, his inner circle went back and forth. Some men wanted to send soldiers. Others remembered what had happened to Schultz and shifted in their seats. Luciano listened. Then he made a decision. "We go to Harlem," he said, "but we don't go with guns first. We go with respect." A message went out. Simple, almost polite. "Lucky Luciano wants a meeting with Bumpy Johnson." Up in Harlem, Bumpy got the message and did something that said more than any reply. He didn't respond. A day passed, then 2, then 3. In a world where ignoring a summons from a boss could get you killed, a week of silence was loud. Bumpy was sending his own message. He understood something most people misunderstood about power. Real power isn't about how fast you say yes. Sometimes it's about how long you can afford to say nothing. While Luciano waited, Bumpy worked. He already knew where the Italians made some of their money: gambling parlors in Brooklyn, warehouses in Red Hook. Cash stuffed into trucks that arrived at night and left before dawn. He also knew something else. Politicians were like street cops. They all claimed to be clean in public, but most of them had mud on their shoes from somewhere. So he started attaching names and faces. Men with cameras followed men in suits. Flashbulbs popped from across the street, behind windows, over the tops of newspapers. Photos were taken, copied, and tucked away. A known police captain shaking hands with a man whose nickname was the Lord High Executioner. A respectable businessman who everyone knew was no such thing, stepping out of a building whose rent was paid in cash nobody could trace. Bumpy didn't need to know every detail of every operation. He only needed one truth: the Italians' greatest protection wasn't guns. It was politics, and politics doesn't survive sunlight. 7 days after the first message, Bumpy finally sent a reply: "Tell Mr. Luciano I'll see him at the Stork Club." The Stork Club on East 53rd Street was the most exclusive club in Manhattan. Frank Sinatra sang there. J. Edgar Hoover drank there. Gossip columnists wrote about it so often it felt less like a place and more like a myth. It was also, on that February night, closed to everyone except a handful of men. Luciano reserved the entire VIP room. No reporters, no curious socialites, just power. He arrived in a dark suit that screamed quiet money, flanked by 6 men who were worth more dead than most people were alive. Frank Costello, the diplomat, the acting boss, the man politicians called when they needed a favor they'd never admit out loud. Albert Anastasia. Broad shoulders, cold eyes, a man whose nickname came with a body count. Lord High Executioner, Mayor Lansky. Small, thin, with the restless hands of an accountant who sees columns instead of people. And 3 bodyguards whose faces you wouldn't recognize, but whose work you'd definitely have heard about. They took their seats around the table, leaving the chair at the head empty. Waiting. Bumpy walked in alone. No soldiers, no entourage, just a 40-year-old man in a tailored navy 3-piece suit, crisp white shirt, and no tie. He never wore ties. A gold watch chain glinted against his vest. His hair was freshly cut. His shoes were polished so bright they caught reflections from the overhead lights. In his right hand, he carried a leather briefcase. The bodyguards moved without thinking, stepping forward to search him, to stop him, to assert control. Hands drifted toward weapons again. Luciano raised a finger. "Let him through." Bumpy walked past them without a glance, his footsteps soft but certain on the marble floor. He didn't hesitate at the head of the table. That chair was usually reserved for the boss. He pulled it out and sat down. He placed the briefcase on the table, clicked one latch open, then closed it again, leaving the contents hidden. He took out a cigar, cut the tip, and lit it, filling the silence with the faint crackle of burning tobacco. Costello's jaw tightened, insult prickling behind his eyes. Anastasia's hand drifted toward his waistband again, fingers itching. Luciano watched all of it and did something most men in his position couldn't. He smiled. He understood what was happening. This wasn't a random act of disrespect. This was a test. Bumpy was setting the terms of the conversation before a single word was spoken. Luciano pulled out the chair directly opposite him and sat. "Mr. Johnson," he said, folding his hands on the table. Thank you for coming. Bumpy took a long drag from his cigar, exhaled slowly, and looked him dead in the eye. Mr. Luciano, he said, you wanted to talk, so talk. Luciano's voice was calm and measured, the voice of a man who'd negotiated with presidents and gangsters and knew exactly how far he could push each. I'm leaving the country in 3 weeks, he began. The feds are shipping me back to Italy. I can't change that, but before I go, I need to make sure New York stays in order. No wars, no chaos. Just business. Bumpy nodded once, said nothing. Harlem is the last piece of the puzzle, Luciano continued. The numbers racket is making millions. My people want in. He didn't say we think we deserve it. He didn't need to. It hung in the air anyway. But I know you've been running things up there since Schultz died. You've got the trust of the community. You've got the infrastructure. You've got the police on your payroll. He paused, locked eyes with Bumpy. I'm not here to take what's yours, he said. I'm here to offer you a partnership. You keep running Harlem. We provide protection, investment capital, and connections. In return, we take 40% of the profits. The room went still. Costello leaned forward, watching. Lansky's fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the table. Anastasia's knuckles cracked like small breaking bones. 40%. That was more than a partner's share. That was tribute. Bumpy took another slow drag, the cigar ember glowing. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle. What happens, he asked, if I say no? Luciano's smile didn't move, but something in his eyes went cold. Then we have a problem, he said. Because if you're not with us, you're against us, and nobody survives being against us. There was no anger in it, no raised voice, just the absolute certainty of a man who'd built an empire on that exact principle. Bumpy set his cigar down in the crystal ashtray. He reached for the briefcase. Every man in the room tensed at once. The bodyguards' hands closed around their weapons. Anastasia half rose from his chair. Costello's hand moved toward his jacket. Bumpy ignored all of it. He opened the briefcase, reached inside, and pulled out a single black and white photograph. He didn't look at it. He slid it across the table. Luciano picked it up with 2 fingers. His face didn't change, but his fingertips tightened ever so slightly on the edges of the photograph. It showed a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, one of Anastasia's gambling operations. Standing in front of it, shaking hands with a police captain every reporter in New York could identify by name, was Albert Anastasia himself. That was taken 3 days ago, Bumpy said quietly. I've got 12 more just like it, different warehouses, different cops, different members of your organization. Silence dropped like a curtain. Costello's hand froze inside his jacket. Anastasia surged halfway out of his chair. Luciano didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the photograph, then he slowly raised them to Bumpy. Are you threatening me? He asked. No, Bumpy said. I'm showing you respect. The word hung in the air, heavier than it had any right to be. Because I could have sent those to the district attorney, Bumpy continued. I could have sent them to the newspapers. I could have burned your whole operation to the ground before you even knew I had them. He leaned forward, elbows on the table now, voice still level. But I didn't. He let that sink in. The fact that they were finding out about this in private, in this room, and not through the screaming headline of a morning paper. You came to Harlem asking for a partnership, Bumpy said. But a partnership means equals. And what you just offered me wasn't a partnership. It was a takeover with a smile. Luciano set the photograph down in front of him. For the first time since Bumpy had walked into the room, something like genuine surprise and respect flickered across his face. So, he said softly, what do you want? Bumpy picked up his cigar again, took a slow, thoughtful drag, and looked past Luciano for a moment, through the wall, as if he could see all the way uptown. You want what Schultz wanted, he said. What every Italian crew that ever looked at Harlem wanted. He pointed in the vague direction of Harlem, beyond the thick walls of the club. Control, he shook his head. But you can't have it, not because you're not smart enough. Not because you're not strong enough, because Harlem isn't yours to control. He turned his gaze back to Luciano. You know why Schultz failed? Bumpy asked. Because he thought black people were stupid. He thought we'd just hand over our money and say, thank you. He thought muscle was enough. He let the accusation float over the table, touching every man there. But Harlem doesn't work that way, Bumpy said. You need trust. You need respect. You need to be one of us. And you, he nodded once toward Luciano, will never be one of us. Costello started to open his mouth, some polite insult or correction on his tongue. Luciano silenced him with a tiny shake of his head. Go on, he said to Bumpy. Bumpy nodded. But here's what I will do, he said. You asked for 40%, you can have 10. Even Anastasia blinked at the number. Too low to be real, too high to be a joke. 10% of the profits, Bumpy specified. Not as protection money, as a service fee. He began to count on his fingers, not because he needed to, but because it turned abstract ideas into concrete points. You provide banking support, he said. We need clean money to pay winners when heavy numbers hit. You provide legal help when our runners get arrested. In return, you get 10% of the net. He leaned back, letting the terms hang in the air. And one more thing, he added, his voice dropping half an octave. You never, and I mean never, send your people into Harlem to collect. He held Luciano's eyes. You want your money, you send a courier to my office. I'll have it counted, wrapped, and ready. But your soldiers don't patrol my streets. Your guns don't show up in my neighborhood. He let the last sentence land like a gavel. Harlem stays black, he said. Harlem stays mine. That's the deal. The silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. Lansky broke it first. He turned his head toward Luciano, mind already doing the math. Charlie, he said softly, that's actually a smart play. 10% for essentially no risk, no overhead, no exposure. It's clean money, Anastasia snarled. And what stops him from cutting us out once we set up the banking? He demanded. Once he's got what he wants, Bumpy answered before Luciano could. The same thing, he said, that stops you from trying to take Harlem by force. He tapped the briefcase with one finger. A stalemate. He looked at Anastasia. You try to cheat me, he said. Those photographs go public and your political protection evaporates. You'll still have your guns. You just won't have anywhere to hide after you use them. He shifted his gaze to Luciano. I try to cheat you, you come after me with everything you've got, and I know you've got a lot. Maybe you kill me. Maybe you even scare Harlem for a while. He shrugged once. But you don't get your 10% anymore, and you lose the only man who can keep your name out of certain people's mouths uptown. We both lose or we both get rich. He spread his hands. Your choice? Luciano stared at him for what felt like an eternity. No one else moved. The entire room, the entire world, shrank down to the space between those two men across that table. Then, slowly, Luciano started to laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It wasn't a threat disguised as a smile. It was the genuine sound of a man who saw himself in another man and couldn't help but appreciate the view. You know what, Bumpy? He said at last. Schultz was an idiot. He should have talked to you first. He stood, smoothing his suit jacket, and extended his hand. 10%, he said. Banking and legal support, no soldiers in Harlem. You deliver the money monthly. Bumpy rose, cigar between his fingers, and took Luciano's hand in a firm, even grip. We have a deal, he said. Costello exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. Lansky smiled, already counting future earnings. Even Anastasia, after a moment, sat back down, fury cooling into a hard, grudging acceptance. Luciano held onto Bumpy's hand a fraction longer than necessary. Let me tell you something, Bumpy, he said quietly. I've done business with presidents, cops, union bosses, killers, but you, he shook his head, half amused, half impressed. You're the first man who came to my table and told me no without pulling a gun. That takes guts or stupidity. I haven't decided which yet. Bumpy's mouth twitched into a rare, genuine smile. When you figure it out, he said, you let me know. 3 weeks later, Lucky Luciano boarded a ship to Italy. He never set foot on American soil again. But the deal he made that night at the Stork Club didn't sail with him. It stayed. For the next 22 years, Harlem's numbers racket flourished. Bumpy ran the business the way he always had. Efficient, disciplined, rooted in the neighborhood. Bets were taken, dreams were played, winners were paid. And every month, like clockwork, 10% moved quietly from Harlem's hidden safes through Italian-controlled banks and into accounts nobody outside that room would ever see. No Italian soldiers came to collect. No unfamiliar crews shook down Harlem streets. The guns stayed where they belonged, in the stories old-timers told about Schultz, not in the hands of strangers on 125th Street. The Italians held up their end, too. When the numbers ran heavy and the payouts threatened to crush local cash, Lansky's banking web stretched and absorbed the shock. When runners got picked up, lawyers appeared who knew exactly which judge owed which favor. In 1951, when Bumpy was arrested on a conspiracy charge and sentenced to years in Alcatraz, the deal didn't die. Frank Costello personally made sure Bumpy's family was taken care of, rent paid, groceries delivered. Not out of charity, out of respect. Because even men who deal in betrayal for a living understand the value of a promise kept. When Bumpy walked out of prison in 1963 and came back to Harlem, the world had changed. The civil rights movement was in full swing. Old neighborhoods were cracking under new pressures, but some things were the same. The game still ran. The 10% still flowed. The photograph of Albert Anastasia, shaking hands with a dirty police captain in front of that Red Hook warehouse, hung on the wall of Bumpy's office until the day he died. Not as a threat, as a reminder. That night at the Stork Club did not become legend because of how many bullets were fired. None were. It became legend because two men from completely different worlds, one Sicilian, one black, one the architect of the commission, one the quiet king of Harlem, sat down at a table and found a way to do business without destroying each other. Years later in Italy, Luciano would tell his associates almost fondly, "Bumpy Johnson was the smartest gangster I ever met, and the most dangerous, because he didn't need me to respect him." He paused, as if tasting the memory. He demanded it. Bumpy never talked publicly about that meeting. He didn't need to. Harlem remembered in its own way. For him, that photograph on the office wall was enough. A cop, a killer, a handshake. A simple truth framed in black and white. Power isn't about who's willing to pull the trigger first. It's about who's smart enough not to. If this story of respect, leverage, and strategy in the shadows of New York moved you, take a second to hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Share this with someone who thinks power is just about being the loudest or the scariest. Someone who needs to hear about the man who made the mob bow to Harlem without firing a shot. And tell me in the comments, if you were in that room with Lucky on one side and Harlem on the other, what would you have done? Keep fighting for your crown, and I'll see you in the next one.